James Wilson stood at the edge of the dusty road, his old pickup truck loaded with boxes behind him. The late afternoon sun sparkled on Lake Evergreen, turning the water into a sheet of gold. He took a deep breath of the pine-scented air and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. After 15 years of only short visits, he was finally home. The small wooden cabin sat just as he remembered it, weathered gray boards, a slightly crooked chimney, and wide windows facing the water. His grandfather had built it with his own hands back in the 1950s, adding bits and pieces over the years. It wasn't much to look at compared to the fancy houses that had sprung up across the lake, but to James, it was perfect. "Can't believe the old place is mine now," he whispered to himself, walking up the creaky steps to the porch. He hadn't been back since the funeral 6 months ago. Pop had lived to be 92, sharp as a tack until the end. James missed him something fierce. All those summers fishing together, learning to swim in the cool, clear water, listening to his grandfather's stories by the fireplace when it rained. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and old books. James ran his hand along the handmade bookshelf his grandfather had built from local oak. Everything was just as Pop had left it. Fishing rods in the corner, the old record player on the side table, faded photos on the walls. One showed James, at age 10, holding up his first big catch while Pop stood proudly beside him. James put his boxes down and opened the windows to let in the fresh air. He'd taken a big step quitting his job at the accounting firm in the city. 12 years of staring at spreadsheets, dealing with angry clients, and struggling to pay rent on his tiny apartment had worn him down. At 37, he'd felt like he was just existing, not living. When the lawyer had called about his inheritance, James had been shocked. He'd expected the cabin, of course, but the rest? That had been a complete surprise. "Mr. Wilson, you should know that your grandfather's property includes more than just the cabin and land," the lawyer had explained. "According to these deeds, your grandfather actually owned the entire eastern portion of Lake Evergreen itself, about 120 acres of water." James hadn't believed it at first. Who owns a lake? But the folder of papers the lawyer had given him told the story. Back in 1923, his great-grandfather had bought the land and water rights together, when the area was nothing but wilderness. Over the years, he'd sold off parcels of land but kept the water rights. When developers came in the 1970s and 80s, Pop had refused to sell his portion of the lake, no matter how much money they offered. As the sun began to set, James took an old kitchen chair down to the dock. The wooden planks swayed slightly under his feet. He'd need to fix that soon. He sat watching the light fade from the sky, thinking about his new life. He'd use his savings to fix up the cabin. Maybe build a few small rental cabins further back on the property. Start a boat rental business for tourists. Pop had always talked about doing that, but never got around to it. A loud engine noise broke the evening quiet. James looked up to see a sleek speedboat cutting across the water, music blaring. It was heading toward the western shore, where huge glass and stone houses now stood like castles. Those hadn't been there during his childhood summers. When James had last spent a whole summer here at age 22, the lake had been mostly quiet. A few vacation homes, some local families, and lots of untouched shoreline. Now the far side looked like a rich people's playground. Private docks with expensive boats, perfect green lawns running down to the water's edge. The next morning, James was up early. He made coffee in his grandfather's old percolator and took it outside to watch the sunrise. A pair of loons called to each other across the misty water, their haunting cries echoing against the hills. He spent the day unpacking and planning repairs. The cabin roof needed work, and the bathroom was straight out of the 1960s, but the bones of the place were solid. Pop had built things to last. Around midday, James walked the property line, following the faded markers his grandfather had pointed out years ago. 5 acres of pine forest sloped down to nearly half a mile of shoreline. At the far end was a small, sheltered cove where he and Pop used to catch the biggest bass. As he stood looking out over the water, his water according to those deeds, he noticed a woman standing on a dock across the small cove. She was staring at him through binoculars. When she saw him looking back, she quickly lowered them and walked back to her house, a massive stone structure with a 3-car garage. That evening, James found a box in his grandfather's closet labeled Lake Documents. Inside were more yellowed papers, newspaper clippings, and old photographs. One article from 1979 showed his grandfather standing proudly next to the lake, the headline reading, "Local man refuses $1 million offer for lake rights." Another showed Pop at a county meeting, apparently arguing against a development proposal. James Dewey realized his grandfather had been fighting to protect this lake for decades. He'd never talked much about it during their fishing trips, but the evidence was all here. Maps with careful red lines marking Wilson water rights, letters from lawyers confirming his ownership. Even a handwritten note that read, "Remember, Jimmy, ownership isn't just about what you can take, but what you can protect for the future." Before going to bed, James walked down to the dock again. The night was clear, stars reflecting on the still water. Across the lake, the big houses were lit up, parties in full swing despite it being a Tuesday. Boats moved across the water, their lights making bright trails on the dark surface. Those people probably had no idea that they were sailing on someone else's property. That the water under their expensive boats belonged to the guy in the rundown cabin with the rusty pickup truck. James smiled to himself. Pop had left him more than just a cabin. He'd left him a legacy, a responsibility, and maybe a little bit of power. The question was, what would he do with it? He didn't have to wait long to find out. The very next day would bring his first clash with the people who thought they owned Lake Evergreen, and James would discover just how valuable his unusual inheritance really was. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect June day that makes you glad to be alive. James woke early, made a quick breakfast, and decided it was time to take out his grandfather's fishing boat. He'd spent 3 days cleaning it up, scrubbing away years of dust, checking the motor, patching a small hole in the hull. It wasn't fancy, just a simple 16-foot aluminum boat with a small outboard motor, but it was sturdy and reliable. "Just like you, Pop," James said, patting the boat's side as he pushed off from the dock. The morning was peaceful. James drifted slowly around, his favorite fishing spot in the cove, letting his line trail in the clear water. He'd caught 2 decent-sized bass and was considering heading back for lunch when he heard it, the roar of a powerful engine cutting through the quiet. Around the bend of the shoreline came the biggest boat James had ever seen on Lake Evergreen. It was a gleaming white yacht, at least 40 feet long, with chrome railings that flashed in the sunlight. Music blasted from hidden speakers, some kind of thumping dance song that echoed across the water. The huge boat was moving fast, much faster than anyone should drive in the narrow section of the lake. James waved his arms, trying to get the driver's attention. The yacht was headed straight toward him and showed no signs of slowing. At the last minute, it swerved, missing his small boat by maybe 20 feet. The wake hit him hard, sending his fishing tackle sliding across the floor and nearly knocking him overboard. "Hey!" he shouted, steadying himself. "Slow down!" To his surprise, the yacht circled back. As it drew closer, James could see a woman at the wheel. She wore a white designer sundress and oversized sunglasses that hid half her face. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect knot that somehow stayed perfectly in place despite the speed of the boat. "You need to move that eyesore of a boat," she called out, pointing at his grandfather's boat with a manicured finger. "This is the route for the regatta this afternoon." James took a deep breath and put on his friendliest smile. No point getting off on the wrong foot with the neighbors, even if they were rude. "Good morning. Actually, I'm well within my property line here." The woman's perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line. She cut the music and brought the yacht around again, idling closer this time. "Perhaps you're new here," she said, looking down at him from her much higher deck. Her voice was honey-sweet, but with a sharp edge underneath. "I'm Diane Harrington, president of the Lake Evergreen Association. We have rules about where fishing is permitted, and this isn't one of those areas." James stood up in his boat, trying to look more impressive. Next to her floating mansion, he felt shabby in his faded t-shirt and old jeans. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Harrington. I'm James Wilson. I just moved into my grandfather's cabin." He pointed toward the shore where his small dock jutted out. "Harold Wilson. He passed away a few months back." Something flickered across Diane's face. recognition, and something else. Annoyance. Old Man Wilson's place. Her perfect nose wrinkled slightly. Well, the rules have changed since his day. The association voted last year. No fishing in this cove anymore. It disrupts the view from the clubhouse. She gestured toward a large building on the western shore with a wide deck overlooking the water. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately or I'll be forced to call security. James felt a flash of anger but kept his voice calm. Security? On a public lake? This isn't a public lake, Diane corrected, her tone suggesting she was talking to a small child. The Lake Evergreen Association manages these waters for our homeowners. We have bylaws. James reached into the waterproof bag beside him and pulled out his phone. He'd scanned all his grandfather's documents after finding them, just to have backup copies. There seems to be some confusion, he said, pulling up the deed. I don't just own the cabin and shoreline. According to these documents, I own this entire half of the lake. Diane's perfect composure cracked. What? That's absurd. It's all legal. My great-grandfather bought the water rights back in the 1920s. My grandfather kept them when the development started on the west shore. James held up his phone so she could see the scanned deed. It's all registered with the county. Diane's face flushed red beneath her expensive sunglasses. For a moment she seemed lost for words. Those are obviously old papers. She finally managed. Things change. The association has controlled this lake for 20 years. Controlled, maybe, James nodded, but not owned. There's a difference. Diane's jaw tightened. She tapped something into her phone with sharp, angry movements. We'll see about that, Mr. Wilson. I suggest you enjoy your fishing while you can. She revved the yacht's engine loudly. This is not over. With that, she spun the wheel hard, creating another wave that rocked James's small boat. He grabbed the sides to steady himself as she roared away toward the western shore. James watched her go, his heart pounding. That hadn't gone well. He hadn't meant to make enemies on his first week back, but he also wasn't about to be bullied off his own property. When he got back to the dock, he noticed a sleek black SUV parked on the road near his cabin. A man in khaki shorts and a polo shirt with Lake Evergreen Security embroidered on the chest was taking photos of his property with a high-end camera. When he spotted James, he quickly got back in his vehicle and drove away. That evening, 3 more expensive boats deliberately cruised past his dock, their occupants staring at him as he sat on his porch. One group of teenagers hooted and laughed, pointing at the cabin's weathered boards and sagging porch steps. Just before sunset, James found a notice taped to his mailbox. Attention, property violation. It read in bold letters. Below was a form letter from the Lake Evergreen Association citing him for unauthorized dock structures and improper boat storage. James crumpled the paper and tossed it in his recycling bin. His grandfather had built that dock 60 years ago, long before there was any association. As darkness fell, he could see lights blazing across the lake at what must be Diane's house, a massive structure of glass and stone that seemed to glow from within. Music and laughter drifted across the water. The weekend people were having a party. James sat on his grandfather's old porch swing thinking. He had come here for peace and quiet, for a simpler life. Instead, it seemed he had landed in the middle of a turf war he never asked for. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Hey, Tom, he said when his old college roommate answered. Remember how you always said I could call if I ever needed a lawyer? I think that time has come. 3 days after the confrontation with Diane, James found a thick envelope in his mailbox. It was made of expensive cream-colored paper with Braidley, Hunt & Associates, attorneys at law, printed in raised gold letters on the front. His stomach tightened as he carried it inside. That didn't take long, he muttered, sitting at his grandfather's old kitchen table to read the letter. The legal language was complicated, but the message was clear enough. The letter claimed that the Lake Evergreen Association had established rights through years of usage and that James's documents were outdated and superseded by current agreements. It demanded he cease making false ownership claims and threatened legal action if he didn't comply. James called Tom that evening, reading him parts of the letter over the phone. "They're trying to scare you," Tom said. "But those property records you showed me are solid. Water rights don't just expire because someone else has been using the lake." "So what do I do?" James asked, watching the sun set over the water. "His water, according to the deeds. Send them my contact information. I'll handle the legal back and forth. Meanwhile, just live your life normally. You have every right to be there." That was easier said than done. Over the next week, James noticed more strange things happening. His mail kept disappearing from his box, only to be delivered all at once, opened and resealed. When he drove to the small town nearby for groceries, he returned to find all 4 tires on his truck flat. "Just bad luck, probably," the local mechanic said with a shrug as he fixed them, but he wouldn't quite meet James's eyes. Walking home from checking his property line markers one afternoon, James overheard 2 landscapers talking as they trimmed bushes at the vacation home next door. "Yeah, that's the guy Diane's trying to run off," one said, nodding toward James. "Heard she's offering a bonus to anyone on staff who makes things difficult for him. Can she do that?" the other asked. "She runs this place like her own kingdom. Nobody crosses Diane Harrington if they want to keep working here." James pretended not to hear, but the conversation bothered him. He hadn't done anything to deserve this treatment. He was just trying to live peacefully on the property his family had owned for generations. That weekend, James decided to check out the community bulletin board at the small grocery store in town. Maybe he could post a note introducing himself to neighbors, try to clear up some misunderstandings. What he found instead made his blood boil. Someone had posted a flyer with his grandfather's cabin circled in red. The text read, "Attention Lake residents. Dangerous squatter alert. Unverified individual claiming ownership rights. Keep children away. Report suspicious activity to Association Security." There was no name on the flyer, but James knew exactly who was behind it. He tore it down, only to find identical ones posted all around town. Back at the cabin, he found a voicemail from Tom. "James, I got a response from the association's lawyer. They're not backing down. In fact, they're claiming your grandfather sold the water rights back in the 90s, but the paperwork was lost. Total nonsense, but they're pushing hard." Things got worse the following Wednesday. James was walking down his driveway when a patrol car pulled up. The officer inside looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Wilson, I've received complaints about trespassing and disorderly conduct. Someone reported you were threatening lake residents." "That's completely false," James said, shocked. "I've barely spoken to anyone except to say hello." The officer nodded. "Figured as much. Look, I went to school with your cousin Bill. I know your family's not troublemakers, but be careful, all right? The summer people have a lot of pull around here." After the officer left, James decided he needed to address things directly. The Lake Evergreen Association held monthly meetings at their clubhouse. The next one was scheduled for that evening. James put on his nicest clothes, clean jeans and a button-down shirt, and drove around to the western shore. The clubhouse was an impressive stone building with a wide deck overlooking the water. Luxury cars filled the parking lot. As he approached the entrance, a security guard stepped forward. "Can I help you, sir?" The man's tone made it clear help wasn't on offer. "I'm here for the association meeting," James said. "I own property on the lake." "Name?" The guard checked a tablet he was holding. "James Wilson." The guard's expression hardened. "You're not on the list. These meetings are for association members only." "I'd like to become a member," James tried. "Membership is by invitation only. I'll have to ask you to leave." Through the window, James could see Diane standing at a podium inside. She was gesturing dramatically, pointing to something on a large screen behind her. A photo of his cabin was displayed, with big red text saying, "Property dispute" across it. "Please, I just want to talk to everyone, explain my side." "Sir?" The guard put a hand on James's shoulder. "Don't make me remove you from the premises." Frustrated, James returned to his truck. As he was backing out, he noticed a man hurrying from the meeting toward him. The man looked around nervously before approaching. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Frank Cooper. I sit on the association board. He handed James a business card. Not everyone agrees with how Diane is handling this. She didn't even tell the full board about your grandfather's documents until today. So why not stop her? James asked. Frank looked uncomfortable. Diane has connections. Her husband's company built most of these homes. Her brother is the county commissioner. But some of us think this has gone too far. He glanced back at the clubhouse. Next week is the Lake Evergreen Festival. Everyone will be there. If you could show people you're not the monster she's making you out to be, it might help. The annual Lake Evergreen Festival was a big deal locally. James remembered attending as a kid with his grandfather. There were boat races, food stands, music, and fireworks. He spent the next few days preparing. He found boxes of his grandfather's old photos showing the history of the lake. Some dated back to the 1930s, showing his great-grandfather helping to stock the lake with fish. Others showed his grandfather leading cleanup efforts in the 1970s when pollution threatened the water. On festival day, James arrived early and set up a small booth at the edge of the festival grounds. He arranged the historic photos carefully, adding small handwritten cards explaining each one. He put out a guest book and a sign that read, "The Wilson Family, Proud Lake Evergreen Caretakers, since 1923. People began to stop by, curious about the old photos. James chatted with them, sharing stories his grandfather had told him, answering questions about the lake's history. For the first time since moving back, he felt like he was making connections. That's when he spotted Diane marching toward his booth, 2 security guards in tow. Her face was tight with anger. "This is private property," she announced loudly, drawing attention from nearby festival goers. "You have no permit to be here, and you need to pack up and leave now." A small crowd gathered, watching the confrontation. James stayed calm. "Actually, according to county records, this shoreline is part of my property. I've been in touch with my lawyer, and he's confirmed that my grandfather's deed is completely valid. We'll see about that," Diane hissed, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the sheriff right now. We'll get this settled once and for all." As she dialed, James noticed something he hadn't expected: the expressions on the faces in the crowd. They weren't glaring at him. They were watching Diane, and many didn't look pleased with what they were seeing. A hush fell over the festival crowd as they waited for the sheriff to arrive. James kept arranging his photos, determined not to be intimidated. Inside, though, his heart was pounding. This confrontation would either resolve things or make them much worse. About 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. Deputy Miller stepped out, a tall man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. James recognized him as an old fishing buddy of his grandfather's. "Afternoon, folks," Deputy Miller said, tipping his hat as he approached. "What seems to be the problem here?" Diane stepped forward immediately, her designer sandals kicking up little puffs of dust on the path. "This man is trespassing on association property," she said, pointing at James. "He's set up this display without permission and is refusing to leave when asked." Deputy Miller turned to James. "And your side, son?" "I'm James Wilson, sir, Harold Wilson's grandson. This festival area is on my property according to the deeds I inherited." James kept his voice calm. "I'm just sharing some local history." The deputy's eyebrows rose. "Harold's grandson? Well, I'll be. Your grandpa was a fine man, best fisherman on the lake." He glanced at the photos. "Got some of his old pictures here, I see." Diane made an impatient noise. "That's all very nice, deputy, but this man is claiming to own property that belongs to the Lake Evergreen Association. We need him removed immediately." "Hold on now," Deputy Miller said. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is a civil matter. I'll need to see documentation from both parties." James retrieved his grandfather's folder of documents from his truck. Diane sent one of the security guards to the clubhouse to get the association's paperwork. While they waited, more festival goers gathered around, curious about the commotion. James noticed people looking at his photos, pointing out places they recognized, some even finding themselves or family members in the older community shots. An elderly man approached one of the pictures, adjusting his glasses to see better. "That's me," he exclaimed, pointing to a young boy in a 1960s photo of a fishing contest. "And that's Harold Wilson giving me my trophy. I caught a 5-pound bass, my first big fish." Soon, others were sharing memories, talking about how the lake used to be. James heard snippets of conversation. "Remember when this was all just woods? My dad used to bring us here every summer. Old man Wilson would let us swim off his dock when we were kids." The security guard returned with a thick binder of association documents. Deputy Miller took both sets of papers and sat on a nearby bench to review them. "While I look these over," he told the crowd, "why don't you folks enjoy the festival? No need for everyone to stand around waiting." But most people stayed, watching curiously. This was more interesting than the face-painting booth or the hot dog stand. After about 15 minutes, Deputy Miller stood up. He looked first at Diane, then at James. "Ma'am," he said to Diane, "it appears Mr. Wilson does indeed own the water rights to the eastern portion of the lake. That's been on the county books for nearly a century." Diane's face flushed red. "That's impossible. We've been managing this entire lake for decades." "Managing isn't the same as owning," the deputy explained patiently. "From what I can see here, the association has been operating as if they owned the whole lake, but they never actually secured the legal rights to Mr. Wilson's portion. His grandfather allowed it because he was a neighborly sort of fellow, but he never signed anything giving up those rights." A murmur ran through the crowd. James could see people looking at him with new interest. "So all this time, the association didn't actually own the whole lake?" someone asked. "That appears to be the case," Deputy Miller said. "According to these records, the Wilson family has owned the eastern water rights since 1923. Diane was practically shaking with anger. "This is absurd. We have lawyers who vetted every inch of this development." "Maybe so," the deputy shrugged, "but they missed this. Water rights can be tricky things." An older woman pushed her way through the crowd. She wore a name tag identifying her as Betty Collins, Festival Committee. "I've been on the association board for 15 years, she said loudly, "and this is the first I'm hearing about any dispute over water rights." "Diane, why wasn't the full board informed about this?" Diane's perfect composure cracked. "Because it's nonsense. Some old papers don't invalidate 20 years of association management." "Actually, ma'am, they do, if they're legal deeds," Deputy Miller said firmly. "Mr. Wilson has every right to be here today. This festival is partly on his property." More people were gathering now, the news spreading through the festival like wildfire. James heard his name being whispered. He saw phones coming out, people taking pictures, texting friends. An older man in a fishing hat approached James. "You're Harold's grandson. He was a good man. Did you know he turned down a fortune for those water rights years ago?" "What do you mean?" James asked. "Oh, must have been 20 years back. Developers wanted to drain part of the lake for more building lots. Would have ruined the whole ecosystem. Your grandfather refused to sell no matter how many zeros they put on the check." The old man shook his head admiringly. "Saved this place, he did, though I don't reckon he got much thanks for it." Others began sharing similar stories. How Harold Wilson had stocked the lake with fish at his own expense, how he'd fought against industrial pollution in the 1970s, how he'd built the first public boat launch. James was stunned. His grandfather had never boasted about any of this. He'd just quietly done what he thought was right for the lake he loved. Deputy Miller handed the documents back to both parties. "As far as the county's concerned, Mr. Wilson's claim is valid. If the association wants to dispute it, that's a matter for the civil courts." He tipped his hat to James. "Your grandfather would be proud to see you carrying on his legacy, son." As the deputy walked away, the crowd remained. But the mood had changed. People were looking at James with curiosity rather than suspicion. Some nodded respectfully. A few even smiled. Diane stood rigid, clutching her binder of now useless papers. The security guards looked to her for instructions, but she seemed at a loss for words. Frank Cooper, the board member who had approached James earlier, stepped forward. "I think we owe Mr. Wilson an apology," he said loudly, "and I move that we invite him to attend our next board meeting as an honored guest, not someone to be turned away at the door. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Diane finally found her voice. "This isn't over, Wilson," she said in a low, angry tone. Then she turned and stalked away, her security guards trailing behind her. People began to approach James's booth again, this time with friendly questions and comments. Many introduced themselves as year-round residents rather than summer people. "We're not all like Diane," one woman assured him. "Some of us remember your grandfather and the good he did for this community." By the end of the day, James had filled his guest book with signatures and messages of support. He'd made connections with neighbors who invited him to cookouts and fishing trips. The festival committee even asked if his photos could become a permanent display in the community center. As he packed up his booth that evening, James gazed out at the lake, glowing golden in the setting sun. For the first time since moving back, he felt like he might truly belong here. Not just as the owner of the water, but as part of the community his grandfather had quietly served for so many years. The week after the festival felt like a fresh start for James. His phone rang constantly with calls from association members wanting to talk. Some were worried about what his ownership meant for their lake access. Others just wanted to introduce themselves properly after years of being told to avoid Old Man Wilson's property. On Tuesday morning, he found Frank Cooper sitting on his porch steps. "Hope you don't mind me dropping by," Frank said, getting to his feet. "Brought some cinnamon rolls. My wife makes the best in the county." They sat on the porch looking out at the calm morning water while they ate. The rolls were indeed delicious. "The board wants to meet with you," Frank said after a while. "Officially this time, not with security guards turning you away." James wiped sticky fingers on a napkin. "What about Diane?" Frank sighed. "She's not happy. Called an emergency meeting Sunday night, tried to get us to vote on legal action against you. But after what happened at the festival, well, nobody has the stomach for that fight anymore. Not when your ownership is clearly documented." "So what does the board want?" James asked. "Honestly, to work something out. People are worried you'll start restricting access to your half of the lake, or charging fees for boat traffic." James watched a family of ducks paddle by. "That was never my plan. My grandfather didn't keep people off the lake, and neither will I." "That's good to hear," Frank nodded. "Meeting's Thursday evening if you're willing to come." This time, when James arrived at the clubhouse, nobody stopped him. The security guard at the door even smiled and held it open. Inside, the meeting room was packed with homeowners. James recognized many faces from the festival. The board members sat at a long table at the front. Diane was there too, sitting stiffly at one end, her face carefully blank. She didn't look at James as he took the seat they'd saved for him. The board president, a friendly-looking man named Bill Thompson, called the meeting to order. "As you all know, we've recently learned that the eastern portion of Lake Evergreen is privately owned by Mr. James Wilson, who inherited it from his grandfather Harold Wilson." He gestured toward James. "We've invited Mr. Wilson here tonight to discuss how we can work together going forward." For the next hour, people asked questions and shared concerns. Would they still be able to boat on the eastern side? Would fishing rules change? Could they swim in the coves as they always had? James listened carefully, then stood to address the room. "I came back here because I love this lake. My family has been caring for it for nearly 100 years. I have no interest in keeping people off the water or changing how you enjoy it." Relief rippled through the crowd. "But," James continued, "I do care about protecting the lake itself. My grandfather fought to keep it clean and natural. That's a legacy I want to honor." He laid out a simple proposal. He would grant the association an easement for recreational use of his portion of the lake. In exchange, they would help preserve the natural shoreline of his property and create a small memorial to his grandfather's environmental work. "Also," he added, "I'd like to see some conservation rules, limits on boat speeds in certain areas, protection for the loons that used to nest here, maybe a quiet time in the early mornings for fishing." The discussion that followed was lively, but respectful. Some of the year-round residents voiced strong support for James's ideas, A few of the summer people grumbled about speed limits, but others seemed genuinely interested in preserving the lake's natural beauty. By the end of the meeting, they had the beginnings of an agreement. A committee was formed to work out the details. 3 association members and James. As people filed out, many stopped to shake James's hand or introduce themselves properly. He heard the same phrase over and over. Your grandfather would be proud. Only Diane remained aloof, leaving quickly without speaking to anyone. The next few weeks were busy. James met with the committee several times. He showed them his grandfather's old maps pointing out wildlife areas that needed protection. He listened to their concerns about maintaining property values and summer recreation. Meanwhile, word spread about his plans to fix up the cabin and possibly build rental cabins on his land. Several people offered to help. A plumber who'd been coming to the lake since childhood, an electrician who remembered fishing with James's grandfather, a retired carpenter who lived down the shore. Hope you don't mind me dropping by, Frank said, getting to his feet. Brought some cinnamon rolls. My wife makes the best in the county. They sat on the porch, looking out at the calm morning water while they ate. The rolls were indeed delicious. The board wants to meet with you, Frank said after a while. Officially this time, not with security guards turning you away. James wiped sticky fingers on a napkin. What about Diane? Frank sighed. She's not happy. Called an emergency meeting Sunday night. Tried to get us to vote on legal action against you. But after what happened at the festival, well, nobody has the stomach for that fight anymore. Not when your ownership is clearly documented. So, what does the board want? James asked. Honestly, to work something out. People are worried you'll start restricting access to your half of the lake or charging fees for boat traffic. James watched a family of ducks paddle by. That was never my plan. My grandfather didn't keep people off the lake, and neither will I. That's good to hear. Frank nodded. Meeting's Thursday evening if you're willing to come. This time, when James arrived at the clubhouse, nobody stopped him. The security guard at the door even smiled and held it open. Inside, the meeting room was packed with homeowners. James recognized many faces from the festival. The board members sat at a long table at the front. Diane was there too, sitting stiffly at one end, her face carefully blank. She didn't look at James as he took the seat they'd saved for him. The board president, a friendly-looking man named Bill Thompson, called the meeting to order. As you all know, we've recently learned that the eastern portion of Lake Evergreen is privately owned by Mr. James Wilson, who inherited it from his grandfather, Harold Wilson. He gestured toward James. We've invited Mr. Wilson here tonight to discuss how we can work together going forward. For the next hour, people asked questions and shared concerns. Would they still be able to boat on the eastern side? Would fishing rules change? Could they swim in the coves as they always had? James listened carefully, then stood to address the room. I came back here because I love this lake. My family has been caring for it for nearly 100 years. I have no interest in keeping people off the water or changing how you enjoy it. Relief rippled through the crowd. But, James continued, I do care about protecting the lake itself. My grandfather fought to keep it clean and natural. That's a legacy I want to honor. He laid out a simple proposal. He would grant the association an easement for recreational use of his portion of the lake. In exchange, they would help preserve the natural shoreline of his property and create a small memorial to his grandfather's environmental work. Also, he added, I'd like to see some conservation rules, limits on boat speeds in certain areas, protection for the loons that used to nest here, maybe a quiet time in the early mornings for fishing. The discussion that followed was lively, but respectful. Some of the year-round residents voiced strong support for James's ideas. A few of the summer people grumbled about speed limits, but others seemed genuinely interested in preserving the lake's natural beauty. By the end of the meeting, they had the beginnings of an agreement. A committee was formed to work out the details. 3 association members and James. As people filed out, many stopped to shake James's hand or introduce themselves properly. He heard the same phrase over and over. Your grandfather would be proud. Only Diane remained aloof, leaving quickly without speaking to anyone. The next few weeks were busy. James met with the committee several times. He showed them his grandfather's old maps pointing out wildlife areas that needed protection. He listened to their concerns about maintaining property values and summer recreation. Meanwhile, word spread about his plans to fix up the cabin and possibly build rental cabins on his land. Several people offered to help. A plumber who'd been coming to the lake since childhood, an electrician who remembered fishing with James's grandfather, a retired carpenter who lived down the shore. Just neighbors helping neighbors, the carpenter said, when James tried to pay him for repairing the sagging porch steps. That's how it used to be around here before it got so fancy. By early August, they had a formal agreement ready. The association would acknowledge James's ownership and help maintain conservation areas. James would grant them an official easement for lake use. They would jointly create a small memorial garden near the public boat launch, with a plaque honoring Harold Wilson's contribution to Lake Evergreen. The signing was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon cookout at James's cabin. People brought folding chairs and potluck dishes. Kids swam off the dock while adults chatted on the shore. For the first time, the invisible line between the year-round residents and the summer people seemed to blur a bit. James was flipping burgers on his grandfather's old charcoal grill when he spotted a familiar white yacht approaching his dock. His stomach tightened as Diane Harrington stepped neatly onto the weathered boards. She looked different somehow, less perfect, more human. She wore simple white pants and a blue top instead of her usual designer outfits. No oversized sunglasses hid her eyes. James set down his spatula and walked to meet her. A hush fell over the nearby guests. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. Diane looked uncomfortable. "The board asked me to be here for the signing." She glanced around at the simple gathering, so different from her elaborate parties. "You've done well. People around here aren't usually quick to accept outsiders." "I'm not really an outsider," James reminded her gently. "No," she agreed. "You're not." She took a deep breath. "I was wrong about you. And about this place." She gestured toward the cabin. "I called it an eyesore that first day on the lake, but seeing everyone here today, it has its own kind of charm." James was surprised by her candor. "Thank you for saying that." Diane looked out at the water. "My husband and I built the first vacation home on the Western Shore 20 years ago. Back then, it was all about making this lake exclusive, turning it into a prestigious address. I never stopped to think about what was being lost in the process." She turned back to him. "The board is voting next month on that conservation plan you proposed. I wanted you to know I'll be supporting it." Before James could respond, she added, "Your grandfather came to talk to my husband once, you know, when we first started building. He warned us not to try changing the lake too much, said it had its own ways that needed respecting. I thought he was just a cranky old man back then." She shook her head with a small, rueful smile. Turns out he was right about a lot of things. The signing itself was simple. Papers were passed around, signatures added, hands shaken. Someone proposed a toast to new beginnings, and plastic cups of lemonade and beer were raised high. As the sun began to set, people gathered on the shore to watch the changing colors on the water. James stood at the end of his dock, taking it all in. He thought about how much had changed in just a few months. His grandfather's old cabin was slowly coming back to life. The first rental cabin was already framed up in the pines behind the main house. He'd hired 2 local kids to help with his boat rental business, which would open next spring with a fleet of canoes and fishing boats. Best of all, a pair of loons had returned to nest in the protected cove. Their haunting calls echoed across the water in the evenings, a sound his grandfather had always loved. "Most people are just trying to protect what they love," his grandfather used to say. "The trick is helping them see that they're all loving the same thing in different ways." As stars began to appear above the darkening lake, James smiled to himself. The water was still his, according to those old deeds. But now, everyone understood why that might have been exactly what Lake Evergreen needed all along.